Nothing like this has ever happened in this neighborhood, on this street, ever.
Tonight, a 2-year-old and her mother are still in the hospital after a shooting that led to the death of a 4-year-old. I'm Tanika Hughes.
And I'm Yona Gavino. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office says the father of the 2 children is the shooter.
A child's bedroom remained untouched. Favorite toys were still where they had been left only hours earlier. Outside, flashing emergency lights illuminated a quiet Jacksonville neighborhood as investigators worked behind a growing line of crime scene tape. Residents gathered in silence, struggling to understand how an ordinary afternoon had turned into one of the city's most heartbreaking family tragedies.
On Friday. I lived over here for 20 years, and we all know each other. Everybody in the neighborhood know each other.
In the hours that followed, very little was officially confirmed. Rumors spread quickly across social media, but detectives urged the public to wait for verified facts. As investigators moved carefully through the scene, every photograph, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement became part of a much larger effort to answer a question that no one in the neighborhood could yet explain. What made the case especially unsettling wasn't only the loss that had occurred. It was the realization that everyone involved knew one another. This was not a random act involving strangers. It was a family already connected by years of shared history, making the events even more difficult for investigators, neighbors, and loved ones to process. As officers reconstructed the timeline, another troubling reality began to emerge. This wasn't a case built around a single moment. Detectives soon discovered that understanding what happened would require looking far beyond that afternoon. The answers, they believed, were buried in a relationship with a history that stretched back years, one that would become just as important to the investigation as the evidence collected at the scene. Over the following days, law enforcement officials, court records, and witness accounts slowly revealed a clearer picture. Piece by piece, investigators assembled a timeline that challenged early assumptions and raised even more difficult questions. Why had events unfolded the way they did? Were there warning signs that had been overlooked? And could this tragedy have been prevented before lives were changed forever? Those questions would lead investigators through a detailed examination of the people at the center of the case, their relationship, the decisions made in the days before everything changed, and the evidence that ultimately shaped the criminal investigation. To understand how this case unfolded, it's necessary to begin long before emergency crews arrived, by looking at the lives of the people whose names would soon make headlines across the country. Before we continue, please note that this documentary discusses homicide and domestic violence. Some viewers may find parts of this case upsetting, and viewer discretion is advised. If you're new here, consider subscribing for carefully researched true crime documentaries built on verified facts. To everyone who's been supporting the channel through your views, comments, likes, and shares, thank you for helping these stories reach more people. Let us know where you're watching from. And now, let's begin. On the 30th of June, 2026, what began as an ordinary Tuesday in Jacksonville, Florida, became the focus of one of the city's most closely watched criminal investigations. By the end of the day, authorities would confirm that a violent incident involving members of the same family had left one young child dead, while 2 other relatives were rushed to the hospital. The case immediately drew widespread attention because of the ages of those involved and the relationship between the victims and the person investigators would soon accuse. At the center of the investigation was Brianna Johnson, a 7-year-old mother, whose life revolved around raising her 2 daughters, Harmony Reed, who was 4 years old, and Rhythm Reed, who was just 2. Detectives quickly established that all 3 were directly involved in the incident that unfolded outside a residence on Jacksonville's north side. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scene they encountered made it clear that investigators would be dealing with far more than an isolated act of violence. As the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office began piecing together the timeline, one fact became increasingly significant. This was not a case involving strangers. Everyone at the center of the investigation shared a deeply personal connection, a detail that would shape every stage of the inquiry and raise difficult questions about the events that led to that afternoon. Those answers, however, required looking beyond June 30 and examining the history that preceded it. At the time of the incident, Brianna Johnson was 27 years old, and by every public account available, her primary focus was raising her two young daughters. Family members and those who knew her described a mother who devoted much of her time to harmony, 4, and rhythm, 2. Like many parents of young children, her daily routine centered on providing stability, meeting their needs, and creating a safe home as they reached important milestones in their early lives. Those close to Brianna said her daughters were at the center of nearly every decision she made. Friends described her as caring and protective, while relatives remembered someone who remained committed to her children despite the challenges she faced in her personal life. Publicly available information suggests she was working toward a more stable future, focusing on her family and trying to move forward from difficulties that had already affected her household. Investigators would later learn that Brianna's relationship had not always been peaceful. Court records and previous law enforcement encounters showed there had been earlier allegations of domestic violence involving the father of her children. Although some of those earlier cases did not result in lasting criminal convictions, they established that the relationship had previously drawn the attention of authorities. Those documented incidents would become an important part of the broader investigation, not because they explained what happened on June 30, but because they provided context for detectives trying to understand the history between the people involved. Before the case became national news, Brianna was known first as a mother raising two young girls. That ordinary role would soon become central to an investigation that examined not only what happened that afternoon, but also the circumstances that had developed over the years leading up to it. At the center of the investigation was Truedale Reed Jr., a 29-year-old Jacksonville resident and the father of Brianna Johnson's two daughters, Harmony and Rhythm. As detectives began reconstructing the events of June 30, they also examined Reed's background, looking for documented history that might help explain the circumstances surrounding the case. That review quickly revealed that his contact with the criminal justice system had begun years before this investigation. According to court records, Reed had accumulated multiple arrests before 2026, including allegations involving domestic violence. One of the most significant cases resulted in a prison sentence after he was convicted of aggravated battery. In a separate incident, authorities also accused him of assaulting his own father. While not every arrest led to a conviction, investigators viewed the pattern of prior allegations and convictions as relevant background when assessing the relationship between Reed and Brianna. Because Reed was a convicted felon, federal and Florida law prohibited him from legally possessing or purchasing a firearm. That legal restriction would later become a significant part of the criminal case filed against him, adding separate firearm-related charges in addition to those directly connected to the events under investigation. Public records also showed that Reed's relationship with Brianna had previously drawn the attention of law enforcement. Earlier domestic violence allegations involving the couple had been documented, although some were later dismissed or did not move forward through the court system. Even so, those prior incidents established a record of conflict that investigators could not ignore when reconstructing the history between the two. By the time detectives completed their initial background review, they were no longer examining a single day's events in isolation. They were looking at a relationship with documented periods of instability, prior encounters with the justice system, and legal restrictions already in place before the 30th of June, 2026. Those facts did not determine what happened that day, but they provided an important foundation for understanding why investigators focused so closely on Reed's history as the case unfolded. Publicly available information about the relationship between Brianna Johnson and Truedale Reed Jr. remains limited, and many personal details, such as when they first met or exactly how their relationship began, have not been confirmed by investigators or court records. Rather than filling those gaps with assumptions, detectives focused on the parts of the relationship that could be documented through official records and prior law enforcement contacts. What is known is that Brianna and Reed shared two daughters, Harmony and Rhythm, making them connected long after their relationship had experienced difficulties. Court records referenced in the investigation indicate that their relationship had previously involved allegations of domestic violence, bringing the attention of law enforcement on more than one occasion. While some of those earlier cases were later dismissed or did not result in convictions, they established a documented history of conflict that investigators considered relevant to understanding the dynamics between the two. The family was living in Jacksonville, and by June 2026, the relationship was no longer described as stable. Although the full nature of their day-to-day living arrangements has not been publicly detailed, investigators confirmed that Brianna and the children remained closely connected to Reed because they shared parental responsibilities. That continuing connection meant interactions between them had not completely ended despite the documented tensions. By the time detectives began reconstructing the timeline, they were looking beyond a single disagreement. They were examining a relationship that had evolved over several years, included repeated contact with the legal system, and involved two young children whose lives connected both parents. That documented history would become an important part of the investigation, providing context without replacing the evidence that investigators would later gather about the events of June 30. In the days immediately preceding the 30th of June 2026, investigators have not publicly disclosed evidence of any specific incident or confrontation that directly foreshadowed what would happen. No verified court records or law enforcement statements released during the early stages of the case identified a particular argument, police response, or reported disturbance in the days leading up to the incident. As a result, detectives avoided drawing conclusions that were not supported by evidence. What investigators did establish was that Brianna Johnson and Truedale Reed Jr. remained connected through their shared responsibility as parents. Although previous court records documented earlier domestic violence allegations involving the couple, authorities have not publicly confirmed any new police intervention or formal complaint immediately before June 30. Investigators also have not released verified information indicating there were significant text messages, phone calls, or witness observations in the days beforehand that clearly signaled what was about to occur. Any claims beyond the official record remain unverified and should be treated with caution. For detectives, this absence of publicly documented warning activity in the final days made the investigation even more important. Rather than relying on assumptions, they focused on building an accurate timeline using physical evidence, witness interviews, official records, and verifiable facts. Their objective was to determine exactly what happened on June 30, based on evidence, not speculation. On the afternoon of the 30th of June, 2026, officers with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office were dispatched to a residence on the city's north side after multiple 911 callers reported hearing gunfire and seeing people in distress outside the home. The calls came in within minutes of one another, prompting an immediate response from patrol officers, firefighters, and emergency medical personnel. According to investigators, the incident unfolded during a confrontation involving Brianna Johnson and Truedale Reed Jr. Detectives later determined that the disagreement occurred outside the residence where Brianna was with her two daughters, Harmony and Rhythm. While the precise subject of the argument has not been publicly disclosed, authorities confirmed that the confrontation escalated rapidly, leaving little opportunity for anyone nearby to intervene. Several neighbors later told reporters they were startled by the sudden commotion. Some recalled hearing raised voices moments before the situation intensified, while others said they only realized something was wrong when emergency vehicles began arriving in the neighborhood. Those witness accounts helped investigators establish the sequence of events, although detectives relied primarily on physical evidence and recorded statements rather than speculation. When the first officers reached the scene, they immediately secured the area and requested additional emergency resources. Their first priority was providing aid to those who had been affected while ensuring there was no continuing threat to nearby residents. At the same time, officers began identifying witnesses and preserving the scene for investigators who were already on their way. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they concluded that Harmony Reed, 4 years old, had died as a result of the incident. Brianna Johnson and Rhythm Reed, who was 2 years old, were transported to a nearby hospital for emergency treatment. Medical teams worked to stabilize both survivors as investigators continued processing the scene. Authorities also determined that Truedale Reed Jr. had left the area immediately after the incident in a vehicle that investigators later identified as a stolen SUV. That information was quickly broadcast to law enforcement agencies across the city, allowing responding officers to begin searching for both the suspect and the vehicle without delay. Within a short time, detectives had secured the neighborhood, established a command presence, and begun documenting every available piece of evidence. Even at that early stage, investigators understood this would become far more than a routine criminal investigation. The evidence collected during those first critical hours would form the foundation of everything that followed, as detectives worked methodically to determine exactly how the events of that afternoon unfolded. As detectives assumed control of the scene, the investigation entered its most critical phase. Patrol officers had already secured the area, allowing crime scene specialists to begin a systematic examination of the property. Every step followed established investigative procedures designed to preserve evidence and reconstruct the sequence of events with as much accuracy as possible. Investigators documented the scene extensively through photographs, measurements, and detailed notes before collecting physical evidence. Detectives also conducted a neighborhood canvass, speaking with residents who had contacted 911 or who might have witnessed part of the incident. Each statement was compared against the physical evidence to determine where accounts aligned and where additional verification was needed. Rather than relying on a single witness, investigators built the timeline by cross-checking multiple sources of information. Evidence technicians recovered items believed to be relevant to the investigation and submitted them for forensic examination. According to authorities, detectives also worked to identify the firearm believed to have been used and determine its connection to the suspect. Because Truedale Reed Jr. was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm due to his prior felony conviction, establishing the origin and possession of the weapon became an important part of the criminal investigation. Investigators also reviewed available surveillance footage from the surrounding area where possible. Detectives examined video that could help establish vehicle movements before and after the incident and compared that information with witness accounts. As is standard practice in major investigations, they also reviewed any available digital evidence, including relevant phone records and other electronic information obtained through lawful investigative procedures. Where applicable, authorities have not publicly disclosed every piece of evidence gathered, and detectives intentionally withheld certain details to protect the integrity of the case. During a media briefing, Michael Paul, Chief of Investigations with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, described the case as a tragic act of domestic violence involving members of the same family. He confirmed the identities of those involved, outlined the known sequence of events, and emphasized that detectives were continuing to verify every detail before drawing final conclusions. Paul also acknowledged the emotional impact the case had on the community, while making it clear that the investigation would be guided by evidence, forensic analysis, and documented facts rather than speculation. By the end of those first investigative stages, detectives had assembled the framework of a timeline that would support the criminal charges filed in the case. With key evidence already secured, investigators shifted their attention to locating Truedale Reed Jr. According to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, officers quickly distributed information about both Reed and the vehicle authorities believed he had used to leave the scene. Detectives coordinated with patrol units across Jacksonville, treating the search as a high priority because of the seriousness of the allegations and the need to bring the situation under control as quickly as possible. The search did not last long. Later that same day, officers located the stolen SUV and safely took Reed into custody without further incident. Once he was detained, investigators began the next stage of the case by formally interviewing him and completing the procedures required before prosecutors could move forward with criminal charges. Based on the evidence gathered during the initial investigation, prosecutors filed multiple felony charges. Those charges reflected both the events of June 30 and Reed's legal status before the incident. Because he had previously been convicted of a felony, investigators also alleged that he was prohibited from legally possessing a firearm under both Florida and federal law. That prior conviction significantly affected the legal framework of the case, adding separate firearm-related offenses in addition to the homicide and attempted homicide allegations. For prosecutors, the charges represented more than a list of criminal counts. They reflected the conclusions investigators believed the evidence supported after examining the crime scene, interviewing witnesses, reviewing forensic findings, and reconstructing the timeline. With Reed now in custody and formally charged, the investigation entered a new phase, moving from gathering evidence to preparing a case that would ultimately be tested in court. Following Reed's arrest, the case quickly entered the judicial system. Within days, he made his first appearance before a judge in Duval County, where the court formally advised him of the charges filed by prosecutors. Given the seriousness of the allegations, the judge ordered that he be held without bond on the most serious counts, meaning he would remain in custody as the case moved forward. The court also prohibited him from having any contact with the surviving victims or potential witnesses. During that initial hearing, prosecutors outlined the broad foundation of their case. They argued that the evidence collected by detectives, including witness statements, physical evidence, and the reconstructed timeline, provided probable cause to proceed. At this early stage, however, the hearing was not intended to determine guilt or innocence. Its purpose was to address the charges, Reed's custody status, and the next procedural steps required under Florida law. Court records also showed that prosecutors scheduled a later hearing at which Reed would be expected to enter a formal plea. As of the latest verified public reporting, the case remains pending, and no trial has taken place. Because of that, no verdict has been reached, no sentence has been imposed, and no victim impact statements have been presented in open court. Those stages of the judicial process can occur only if and when the case proceeds to trial or another lawful resolution. Legal analysts following the case noted that proceedings of this nature often take months before reaching trial. Evidence must be reviewed by both sides, additional motions may be filed, and the court must ensure that every constitutional and procedural requirement is met. While the public naturally wanted immediate answers, the legal process was only beginning. For investigators and the victim's family, the courtroom marked the next chapter in the pursuit of justice. The focus shifted from collecting evidence to presenting it through the judicial system, where every fact would ultimately be examined according to the law. The events of June 30 left a lasting impact far beyond a single Jacksonville neighborhood. In the days that followed, family members, neighbors, community leaders, and local advocacy organizations expressed grief for Harmony Reed and concern for Brianna Johnson and Rhythm Reed as Brianna and her youngest daughter continued their recovery. The case also prompted renewed discussion about domestic violence, particularly when prior allegations have already brought families into contact with the justice system. Among those speaking publicly was Karen Williams, who emphasized that domestic violence often follows a pattern rather than arising from a single isolated event. She explained that controlling behavior, repeated threats, and escalating conflict can become warning signs that should never be ignored. Williams also encouraged anyone experiencing abuse or concerned about someone they know to seek help from trusted family members, law enforcement, or organizations that specialize in supporting victims. Her comments were not directed only at this case, but reflected a broader effort to encourage earlier intervention before situations become more dangerous. As of the latest verified public information, Truedale Reed Jr. remains charged in connection with the case, and the criminal proceedings are continuing through the Florida court system. Because the judicial process is still underway, The allegations against him have yet to be decided at trial. Like every defendant in the United States, he is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. For investigators, this case became more than reconstructing a timeline. It was about carefully documenting the facts, preserving the evidence, and ensuring that every decision could withstand the scrutiny of the courtroom. For Brianna Johnson's family, however, no legal outcome can erase what happened or restore what was lost. Cases like this also remind us why factual reporting matters. Behind every headline are real people whose lives have been permanently changed, and every detail deserves to be handled with care, accuracy, and respect. If you value thoroughly researched true crime documentaries that prioritize verified facts over speculation, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps bring attention to important cases, encourages informed discussion, and ensures that victims are remembered with dignity rather than reduced to headlines. If you have thoughts about this case, please share them respectfully in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.